Hi, I'm Kathryn Kure. I'm chapter lead of Creative Commons South Africa and passionate about policy that will enable open education. When I was facilitating the development of an OER policy for a University of Science and Technology, I discovered there was a gap in terms of guidance with relation to software licensing. I hence reached out to Jonathan and Andrew.
I'm Andrew Rens. I'm a legal scholar and policy expert who looks at law and technology. I completed my doctorate at Duke Law School at Duke University in North Carolina, where I wrote about the use of Creative Commons licenses for open educational materials.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Poritz. I'm a former professor of math and computer science at a number of US and European universities. I've adopted, adapted, and created many OER myself and worked with groups that support OER work, including statewide open ed organizations in California, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, to go alphabetically. Though I am not a lawyer myself and nothing I say constitutes legal advice, I have facilitated the Creative Commons certificate course 10,000 times if you read it base 2.
This lightning talk is a result. It must be noted that the contents of this talk do not constitute legal advice. When in doubt, please consult a lawyer. Not all of today's OER look like the traditional textbooks going back hundreds of years, having text interspersed with images and diagrams. Today's open pedagogy approaches often revolve around OER, which have interactive components using software embedded in the OER and may refer students to large, open access databases. Examples of interactivity in OER include the above. We fully acknowledge that within the software community, great and exacting attention has been paid to software licenses, but there is a lack of formalization, particularly at the level of policy in higher education. We need to make conscious decisions about how to license each type of resource in a manner that is both rational and consistent with the aims of open education. Course content and software, as well as databases, should all be licensed appropriately. When we look at the guidelines for the development of open education resource policies in higher education produced by UNESCO and the Commonwealth of Learning, the focus is on content in terms of LTSM. It is evident from praxis relating to dual software and text productions that the open education community requires educational materials and guidance on how to license software with appropriate non-CC licenses. If software is not explicitly open, then it is not open. It must be noted that as long ago as 2008 in the Cape Town Declaration, it was stated that open education is not limited to just open educational resources. It also draws upon open technologies that facilitate collaborative, flexible learning and the open sharing of teaching practices that empower educators to benefit from the best ideas of their colleagues. It called upon educators, authors, publishers, and institutions to release their resources openly. These open education resources should be freely shared through open licenses, which facilitate use, revision, translation, improvement, and sharing by anyone. It is long overdue that open education moves past static objects such as textbooks. And in the Cape Town Declaration Plus 10 document, there was an acknowledgement of the need to move rapidly beyond textbooks. But what should be the policy with regard to licensing? First, we must look at what not to do. Creative Commons is clear that copyright is limited in terms of its application to software. In fact, they do not recommend using the CC licenses for software. Instead, the recommendation is to license under a FLOSS license, which not only makes it free, as in speech, not beer, and the L for Libre makes clear that these are free to use, but not free as in gratis for nothing, but also open source. One of the important things that software licenses deal with, which CC licenses based on copyright cannot deal with, is other intellectual property, such as patents found within software. However, there is a real plethora of software licenses out there. What should we do? First, we have selected only those licenses that comply with the open source initiatives, are verified in terms of the open source definition. In brief, they allow software to be freely used, modified, and shared, are international and popular with a strong community. Next, we focus upon those which can be mapped onto our understanding of OER.
Software is subject to copyright, so why not use a Creative Commons license for software? Before Creative Commons and before open educational resources, open source software devised a whole series of licenses. free software licenses, which impose a copyleft or share-alike component with a strong copyleft in the general public license, or a weaker copyleft in Apache and Mozilla, or attribution-only type licenses, such as the BSD licenses and the MIT license. These preceded open educational resources as we think of them now, but that doesn't mean that open educational resources doesn't include software. The Cape Town Declaration on Open Educational Resources is very clear that open educational resources include software resources. But if we are not to use a Creative Commons license on them, what should we use? And in order to ensure that they are remixable as required by the Cape Town Declaration on Open Education, we should use FLOSS licenses. These are licenses that at a minimum are regarded as compliant with the open source definition, which is maintained by the Open Source Initiative. You'll notice if you look at the Open Source Initiative list of licenses that there is no non-commercial component to FLOSS licenses. They're either the equivalent of CC BY or CC BY SA. Moreover, they all require source disclosure, because without source disclosure, you can't remix the software. There's another element in open education resources which might require separate licensing, and that's data. So data can be licensed under the Creative Commons 0 license, which is the current gold standard, or under CC BY or CC BY SA. Data is licensed separately and should be always licensed under the 4.0 or later suite of Creative Commons licenses, because although data can be subject to copyright in many jurisdictions, including some kinds of data compilations in the United States, it also is subject to specific sui generis database rights in Europe. And so there's a tendency to license data separately. There will be pushes for new data licenses in future, but at present, certainly for the purposes of open education resources, CC0 is the gold standard. The big difference between Creative Commons licensing and open source licenses is that there are multiple institutions and players who initiated their own open source licenses. Thus, Berkeley and the University of California has 4 separate BSD licenses. MIT thankfully has only 1, which is why MIT is preferable to BSD, because although legally they're very similar, it's at least clear which one you're speaking about. The Free Software Foundation has released the general public license, and there are a host of others. Creative Commons, however, covered the spectrum. So they dealt with not just attribution and not just share alike, but they also had the elements of non-commercial and non-derivatives. And when these are mixed up, they give us 6 separate licenses. And as a consequence, we can understand when something is compatible between one license as an input into another, maybe more restrictive license as an output. Now, we can also understand immediately the boundaries between them. This is much clearer for Creative Commons than it is for FLOSS licensing. But for FLOSS licensing, if in doubt, use the general public license.
Quick comment here that we are advocating for a copyleft style license like the GPL v3 or CC BY SA 4.0, since attribution-only licenses like CC BY 4.0, MIT, or BSD leave an opening for bad actors who do exist, as we have seen in the community, to make small adaptations of an OER and lock up the resulting new work under all rights reserved copyright. All right, at the end here, I'd like to wrap around to Kathryn's story at the beginning of needing to come up with a policy for OER, which have both static and dynamic components. One of the coolest OER I've seen in years was a highly interactive suite of mathematics OER made at the University of Colorado, Denver, whose authors didn't really have in place mechanisms to license the huge, vital, and pedagogically important software part of their work. With the recommendations on this slide, policymakers can be ready to support such innovation, and practitioners can know which license to look for in others' work and which to apply to their own work. Thank you for your time and attention. Our slides are openly licensed and available.